June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy. A German reconnaissance pilot banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109 over the French countryside, camera clicking away at what appears below. Through the lens, an entire American armoured division, hundreds of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, supply trucks, massing for what can only be a major offensive thrust toward the Seine. He returns to base. Intelligence officers pore over the photographs. Wehrmacht commanders shift two panzer divisions to counter this gathering storm. But there was no storm, there were no tanks, no artillery, no division. What that pilot photographed, what fooled German high command, was rubber, canvas, wood, paint, and the most audacious bluff in military history. The men who pulled it off weren't career soldiers, they were artists, designers, sound engineers, men who knew more about canvas and pigment than tactics and firepower. And in 21 missions across the bloodiest battlefields of Europe, they would save thousands of lives by perfecting the art of military deception. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. In early 1944, as Allied planners prepared for D-Day, a peculiar recruiting campaign began filtering through art schools, advertising agencies, and design studios across America. The army was looking for a special kind of soldier, men with no combat experience required, but with very specific skills: illustration, industrial design, sound recording, theatre. The official designation was mundane, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but the mission was anything but. Under the classified directive of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, this unit would weaponize creativity itself. Approximately 1,100 men eventually comprised this phantom force. Their roster reads like a future who's who of American art and design. Bill Blass, who would become one of the 20th century's most celebrated fashion designers, served as a sergeant. Ellsworth Kelly, destined for art history immortality with his minimalist paintings, was there. So was wildlife artist Arthur Shilstone, photographer Art Kane, and dozens of others who would shape American visual culture for decades after the war. But in 1944, they were simply soldiers with strange orders. The concept of military deception was ancient, as old as warfare itself. The Trojan horse, Hannibal's nocturnal cattle stampede at Lake Trasimene. But never had deception been engineered on this scale, with this level of technological sophistication. The Ghost Army's arsenal was revolutionary. Working with engineers from the Army's experimental station at Pine Camp, New York, and industrial designers from commercial studios, they developed three primary deception systems. Visual deception. The centerpiece was a fleet of inflatable equipment. Full-size replicas of M4 Sherman tanks, M7 pre-self-propelled howitzers, 155mm long tom artillery pieces, half-tracks and supply trucks. These weren't crude balloon animals. The inflatables were engineered from rubberized canvas, with careful attention to proportions, shadows and details that would convince aerial reconnaissance. A four-man team could inflate a 40-ton Sherman tank in 15 minutes using portable air compressors. The rubber tank weighed just 85 pounds, light enough for two men to carry. From 1,500 feet, the minimum safe altitude for German reconnaissance flights over Allied-controlled territory, these decoys were virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. The designers had studied how actual armoured vehicles appeared in aerial photographs, replicating wear patterns, track marks, camouflage netting deployment, and even the characteristic spacing of vehicles in tactical formation. Sonic deception, perhaps most ingeniously the 3132 Signal Service Company Special, developed what they called heater units, truck-mounted sound systems capable of projecting recorded battlefield noises up to 15 miles under ideal atmospheric conditions. These weren't simple recordings played back. The Sonic Deception team, many with backgrounds in radio drama and sound engineering, created elaborate audio programs, the grinding rumble of M4 tank engines idling and revving, the distinctive clatter of M3 half-track treads on cobblestone, the hydraulic whine of artillery pieces being positioned, engineers hammering pontoon bridges, the cadence of infantry companies marching, supply trucks downshifting on hills. Each sound was recorded from actual military units, then carefully edited and mixed. The playback systems used 500-watt amplifiers, enormous by 1940s standards, connected to directional speaker arrays. According to declassified technical manuals, the sonic teams could create the auditory signature of a battalion, moving through woodland at night, complete with realistic spatial positioning and Doppler effects. The psychological impact on enemy forces was profound. A German soldier hearing the rumble of armour massing 2 kilometres away all night long would report tank formations, even if nothing was there but speakers hidden in tree lines. Radio deception. The 3132 Signal Service Company Special also ran spoof radio operations. Radio operators, called fists in Army parlance, developed distinctive sending patterns. The rhythm and timing of their Morse code transmissions was as recognisable as handwriting. German signals intelligence units tracked specific radio operators to identify which Allied units were in which sectors. The Ghost Army's radio team studied captured German intelligence reports to understand exactly what the enemy was listening for. Then they mimicked it. Operators would copy the fist patterns of real units, sending dummy traffic that suggested entire divisions were present. They'd simulate radio security breaches, letting false information slip that German listeners would intercept and believe they'd discovered through clever eavesdropping. But perhaps the most human and most daring element was what the Army classified as special effects, but the men simply called the con. Soldiers from the Ghost Army would enter towns near the front, wearing the shoulder patches and insignia of other divisions. They'd drink in cafes, flirt with locals, talk just a little too loudly about which unit they were with, where they were headed. In occupied France, where German intelligence networks still operated, this theatre craft often reached enemy ears within hours. It was dangerous work. These men carried no heavy weapons. If discovered, they'd be vastly outnumbered in hostile territory, wearing false insignia, which, under certain interpretations of the Geneva Convention, could theoretically be considered espionage rather than lawful combat. Yet they volunteered for it, again and again. The 23rd landed in France on July 2nd, 1944, less than a month after D-Day, as Allied forces were still clawing their way through Normandy's Bocage country. Their first mission, Operation Elephant, came almost immediately. The strategic situation was precarious. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's First Army was preparing a major offensive near St. Lo, but the sector was dangerously thin. The genuine 2nd Armoured Division needed to shift position for the attack, leaving a critical gap in the line, the Ghost Army's mission. Make the Germans believe the 2nd Armoured hadn't moved at all? For men who trained in the relative safety of American bases, the reality of frontline France was visceral. The smell, something veterans could never quite describe to civilians, a combination of cordite, diesel exhaust, churned mud, and death. The distant crump of artillery, constant as a heartbeat. The occasional crack of a sniper's Mauser, reminding everyone that the front line was measured in yards, not miles. Working at night, because German air reconnaissance still operated during daylight hours, the Ghost Army soldiers manhandled their rubber tanks into position. 4-man teams would drag a Sherman decoy from a truck, unfold it, attach air hoses, and watch it inflate like some surreal magic trick. What emerged looked laughably fake up close. Creases visible, slight sag in the turret, the wrong weight distribution, but from altitude in dawnlight or dusk shadow, photographed through gun camera lenses at 200 miles per hour, it was utterly convincing. They learned quickly that authenticity lay in details invisible to the men creating them. Sergeant Victor Dowd, formerly an industrial designer for General Motors, discovered that real tank battalions left specific track patterns where vehicles manoeuvred. So Ghost Army soldiers dragged actual tank treads behind trucks, creating false trails through mud. They scattered empty fuel drums, the detritus of real armoured units. They hung laundry between fake vehicles, strung communication wire, posted guards. The sonic teams, meanwhile, were learning the acoustic properties of Norman terrain. Sound carried differently over hedgerows than open fields. Humidity affected how far engine noise travelled. On Operation Elephant, they positioned their speakers 3 kilometres behind the fake tank assembly area, playing the sounds of armour moving into position, tracked vehicles arriving in column, then dispersing to tactical spacing, engines idling through the night. According to radio intercepts declassified decades later, German intelligence reported the 2nd Armoured Division as in position in the exact sector where only rubber and speakers existed. The actual 2nd Armoured, 6,000 men and 350 real tanks, moved undetected. The offensive succeeded, the Ghost Army had worked, but the cost of the Normandy campaign was becoming horribly clear. The hedgerow fighting was butchery, small unit actions where riflemen died within arm's reach of each other. By late July, some American divisions had suffered 100% casualties among their frontline infantry companies. Not that every man was dead, but that the original troops who'd landed on D-Day had been killed or wounded and replaced, some companies multiple times over. The Ghost Army men living just behind the front saw the ambulances rolling back, heard the screams from aid stations, watched grave registration teams work through the night. They knew what their deceptions were for. Every German unit fixated on a phantom division was a unit that wouldn't be shooting at real American soldiers. Operation Brittany in August 1944 would test them further, as General Patton's Third Army broke out from Normandy and raced across France. The Ghost Army was tasked with simulating Patton's entire 6th Armoured Division near Brest, a major port city held by a determined German garrison, while the real 6th Armoured drove east toward Paris. The scale was staggering. An armoured division in 1944 comprised roughly 15,000 men, 350 tanks, 600 other vehicles, and organic artillery battalions. The Ghost Army, 1,100 men total, had to convince German reconnaissance that all of it was besieging Brest. They inflated over 600 pieces of dummy equipment. The sonic teams ran continuous playback loops, tank engines, artillery fire, bridge construction, for 4 days straight. Radio operators sent hundreds of dummy messages in the traffic patterns of a division headquarters. Private Arthur Shilstone, the wildlife artist, recalled decades later, with the measured uncertainty of memory. We painted fresh mud on the rubber tanks every morning because real vehicles got dirty. We moved them slightly every night because real units repositioned constantly. We even punctured a few and left them partially deflated, like vehicles that had thrown a track or broken down. The illusion wasn't in individual details. The Germans reinforced Brest. They held the city with fanatical determination, tying down forces, exactly as Allied planners wanted. Meanwhile, Patton's actual armour was liberating village after village across central France, meeting only scattered resistance because German reserves had been committed elsewhere, including against a threat that didn't exist. It was during Brittany that the Ghost Army suffered its first casualty. Private First Class Edward Blow, a 23-year-old scenic designer from Ohio, was killed by German artillery fire while positioning dummy equipment. The official records are sparse. Combat deaths were so common in summer 1944 that individual circumstances often went unrecorded unless they involved something extraordinary. What we know, from letters his unit members sent to his family, archived at the National World War II Museum, was that Blow had volunteered to place decoys in an exposed position to make the illusion more convincing from a specific German observation post. The irony was crushing. A man killed while pretending to be a soldier. Yet in that death lay the paradox of the Ghost Army's entire mission. The danger was utterly real, even when everything else was fake. By autumn 1944, the Ghost Army had become essential to Allied planning. As American forces pressed toward Germany's borders, the unit participated in increasingly sophisticated operations. The battlefield was changing, more fluid, faster moving, with both sides conducting aggressive reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance. Operation Wiltz in September demonstrated the Ghost Army's evolving tactics. The 8th Corps needed to shift 2 divisions south for the assault on the fortified city of Metz. For 3 days, the 23rd had to make the Germans believe those divisions hadn't moved. This time they added a new dimension: fake message drops. Small aircraft would accidentally drop supply containers marked with specific division insignia, containing planted documents with false information about unit positions and objectives. German patrols would find them, rush them to intelligence officers, and the deception would be reinforced through multiple channels simultaneously. Visual decoys, sonic emissions, radio traffic, and captured documents all telling the same false story. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, the Ghost Army's commanding officer, wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy's response time to our deceptions has decreased markedly. They now react to perceived threats within 12 to 18 hours, suggesting our methods have achieved full credibility." In other words, the Germans trusted what the Ghost Army showed them. But the Ghost Army's greatest test, and perhaps their most consequential mission, came during the horrific autumn fighting along Germany's western frontier. Operation Betemburg in late October 1944 coincided with the Third Army's advance toward the Saar region. The strategic situation was darkening. The Allied breakout from Normandy had stalled against prepared German defences. Supply lines stretched back to Normandy beaches. The major ports still hadn't been captured or weren't yet operational. Eisenhower's grand offensive was grinding down into the kind of attritional warfare that had characterised World War I. And German resistance was stiffening. These weren't the demoralised occupation troops of France. These were Germans defending their homeland, fighting from prepared fortifications with interior supply lines. The Ghost Army's mission was to simulate the 4th Armoured Division, one of Patton's most elite formations, threatening a crossing of the Moselle River north of the actual attack point, drawing German reserves away from the real thrust. The technical execution was extraordinarily complex. The notional 4th Armoured had to conduct a believable multi-day approach to the river, reconnaissance probes, artillery registration, engineer work on approach roads, bridging equipment moving forward. Each phase had to be represented across all deception channels. The sonic team recorded real bridging operations from an engineer battalion, capturing the distinctive sounds, pneumatic hammers driving anchoring pins, pontoon sections being manhandled into position, the hollow boom of bridge sections connecting. They played these recordings at night near the river, at precisely the locations where bridge construction would logically occur. Dummy vehicles were arranged in assembly areas with careful attention to tactical doctrine, exactly where and how a real armoured division would stage for a river crossing. Radio traffic simulated the headquarters of the 4th Armoured coordinating with Corps artillery for preparatory fires, and the special effects teams went into overdrive. Soldiers wearing 4th Armoured patches visited river towns, ostentatiously asking locals about water depth, current speed, river bottom conditions, exactly what engineer reconnaissance teams would ask. They got drunk in taverns and talked too loudly about crossing the river up north. They handed out cigarettes to children with casual mentions of being across the Moselle by next week. According to captured German documents, declassified in 1996, Wehrmacht intelligence identified the 4th Armoured as a major threat to the Moselle sector. 2 infantry divisions and elements of an SS Panzer Brigade were shifted north to counter the anticipated crossing. The real 4th Armoured crossed 25 kilometres south, encountering only a screening force. They established a bridgehead. They held it. Reinforcements poured through. How many lives did that deception save? We can't know with certainty. But in the grinding arithmetic of combat, when American forces crossed a river against light resistance, instead of prepared defences backed by armour, the difference was measured in hundreds of casualties avoided. Private Harold Dahl, a sound engineer from Chicago, wrote to his wife, "We work in the dark and nobody will ever know what we do, but I sleep better, knowing that somewhere boys are going home because of what we made the Germans believe." Then came December 1944. The Ghost Army was pulled into reserve near Luxembourg, preparing for their next operation. The front had stabilised. Replacements were arriving. There was cautious optimism that the war might end before spring. On December 16th, 3 German armies smashed through the Ardennes in what would become the Battle of the Bulge. The Ghost Army's planned operations were scrapped. As Allied forces reeled back from the surprise attack, as entire American units were surrounded or overrun, the 23rd was thrown into emergency deployment. Operation Koblenz was improvised within 48 hours. The objective? Simulate the 75th Infantry Division, moving into defensive positions along the Meuse River, the last major water barrier before the Allies' supply hub at Liège, while the actual 75th deployed further south to help contain the German penetration. The weather was catastrophic. The worst winter in European memory, freezing fog, snow, sub-zero temperatures. The same weather that grounded Allied aircraft also made German aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible, which meant the Ghost Army's visual deceptions were less critical. But radio and sonic deception took on heightened importance. The rubber tanks designed for temperate conditions became brittle in the cold. Several split when inflated. The air compressors froze. The sonic equipment malfunctioned. Speaker membranes cracked. Vacuum tubes shattered in their housings. Yet the mission demanded they perform. Because somewhere in the Ardennes, surrounded in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was holding against impossible odds. Every German unit fixated on a false threat was a unit that wasn't reinforcing the attack on Bastogne. The Ghost Army soldiers worked through the night in conditions that would have shut down normal military operations. They repaired equipment with numb fingers. They kept the sonic systems running by rotating the trucks to warming stations. keeping engines running continuously to generate heat. Radio operators sent their dummy traffic from frozen dugouts, breaking ice from their equipment every few hours. Staff Sergeant Hal Lehner, a radio operator, recalled decades later, "Your fingers would stick to the metal keys. You'd tap out code and leave skin behind. But we kept transmitting because we knew what was at stake. The Bulge would be the bloodiest battle Americans fought in Europe, nearly 20,000 killed, 80,000 total casualties. But the German offensive spent itself against determined resistance. By January, Allied forces were counterattacking. The Ghost Army had contributed its small part, maintaining deceptions even when circumstances made it nearly impossible. By March 1945, the Allied armies stood on the Rhine's western bank, the last great natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland. The crossing would be the largest opposed river assault since D-Day, involving multiple armies, airborne operations, and massive material concentration. It would also feature the Ghost Army's most elaborate deception, Operation Viersen. The strategic concept was elegant. Make the Germans believe the British 21st Army Group would cross at one location, near Viersen, drawing reserves there, while the actual crossing occurred kilometres south near Wesel. This required the Ghost Army to simulate not just American units, which they'd been doing for months, but British divisions, with entirely different equipment profiles, radio procedures, tactical doctrines, and even vehicle recognition signatures. The Ghost Army acquired British vehicles, or at least a few examples, and studied them intensively. British tanks, like the Churchill and Cromwell, had different engine notes than American Shermans. British artillery, the 25-pounder, had a distinctive bark compared to American 105mm howitzers. Even British supply trucks, Bedford QLs, sounded different than American GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks. The Sonic team recorded British units, creating entirely new audio programs. Radio operators learned British communication protocols, including the distinctly different voice procedure the British used. And crucially, the Ghost Army coordinated with actual British deception units, the camouflage companies of 21st Army Group, to ensure the false picture was consistent across the entire operational area. The scale of Viersen was unprecedented. Over 2 weeks, the Ghost Army moved multiple times, creating the appearance of several divisions staging for assault. Dummy bridging equipment appeared at crossing sites. Sonic programs played river crossing rehearsals nightly. Radio traffic simulated intense pre-assault coordination. The special effects teams reached new levels of audacity. Wearing British insignia, Ghost Army soldiers entered German-speaking border towns that hadn't been fully cleared of enemy agents. They visited churches, asking priests about river crossings in the area, knowing the clergy would be approached by German intelligence. They deliberately let themselves be seen making detailed sketches of riverbanks, acting like engineer reconnaissance teams. Some operations bordered on suicide. Corporal George Martin, a theatre student from Yale, reportedly walked into a partially destroyed German town dressed as a British captain, accompanied by 2 aides, and loudly demanded the local baker provide bread for the Guards' armoured division arriving tomorrow. The baker, known to be reporting to German intelligence, passed the information along. Martin and his team were behind enemy lines for 3 hours. According to declassified German documents, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht identified the Viersen sector as a primary threat. Panzer reserves were positioned to counterattack any crossing there. Artillery was concentrated, elite infantry divisions reinforced the defences. On the night of March 23, 1945, the actual Allied crossing began at Wesel, 25 kilometres from where the Germans expected it. British and American forces, supported by massive artillery preparations and airborne drops, stormed across the Rhine against lighter-than-anticipated resistance. Within 48 hours, the Allies had established bridgeheads. Within a week, armour was pouring across pontoon bridges, breaking out into Germany's interior. The end of the war was now a matter of weeks, not months. The Ghost Army's contribution was acknowledged in classified after-action reports. General William Simpson, commanding the 9th Army, wrote, "The enemy's defensive dispositions along the Rhine demonstrated conclusively that our deception operations achieved their objectives. Enemy forces were concentrated against non-existent threats, allowing actual assault forces to achieve surprise and minimize casualties. But for the men of the 23rd there was no celebration. They knew better than anyone how fragile their illusions were, how close they'd come to discovery on dozens of occasions, How much had depended on German mistakes and limitations rather than Allied perfection, and they were exhausted. 20 months of continuous operations, living just behind the front lines, working through nights, always moving, always setting up the next deception. Several men had been wounded by artillery fire or air attack. One had been killed, others had been captured while conducting special effects operations and spent months in POW camps before being liberated, their true mission never discovered by their captors, another small miracle. As Allied forces drove into Germany's collapsing interior, the Ghost Army's mission set changed. They conducted smaller operations, simulating reinforcements arriving at threatened sectors, creating phantom build-ups to encourage German withdrawals, maintaining radio traffic for units that no longer existed because they'd been destroyed in combat. Operation Bouzonville in April 1945 was their 21st and final major deception. The objective was almost mundane by their standards: simulate a division to tie down German forces in the Saar pocket while American armies raced east toward the Elbe River. They set up their rubber tanks, played their sound programs, transmitted their radio traffic, walked through towns in false uniforms. It worked, as it had worked 20 times before, but by now Germany was disintegrating. The deceptions hardly mattered anymore. The Wehrmacht was out of reserves to shift, out of fuel to move them, out of coherent defensive strategy. The Ghost Army was performing for an audience that could no longer respond. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Ghost Army had executed 21 major tactical deceptions across 10 months of continuous combat operations. They had simulated more than 30 different Allied divisions. They had created false threats that drew German forces away from actual battles. According to estimates calculated by Army intelligence analysts in the 1950s, the Ghost Army's operations likely saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives by reducing enemy resistance at critical points. But none of this would be known for 50 years. The Ghost Army was deactivated in July 1945. The 1,100 men who had served scattered back to civilian life. They returned to art studios, advertising agencies, design firms, universities. They resumed the careers that had been interrupted by war, and they didn't talk about what they'd done. This wasn't merely the typical veteran's reluctance to discuss combat. The Ghost Army's operations remained classified at the highest levels. Each man had signed security oaths. The official documents, after-action reports, technical manuals, operational plans, were stamped top secret and locked away. The Army's reasoning was sound from a military perspective. Deception techniques that had worked in World War II might work in future conflicts. The specific methods, how rubber tanks were constructed, how sonic deception was engineered, how radio spoofing was conducted, remained militarily useful. The Cold War was beginning, and both sides were studying World War II deception operations for future applications. So the men who had served in the 23rd couldn't even tell their families the full truth about what they'd done. They'd say they'd been in a special unit or signals, or offer vague descriptions that satisfied curiosity without violating security oaths. Bill Blass became a fashion industry icon, dressing first ladies and movie stars. He never publicly mentioned the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most celebrated abstract artists, his work hanging in major museums worldwide. His military service was a footnote in biographies, with no details about what that service entailed. Some of the men processed their experience through their art. The stark colour fields in Kelly's later paintings might reflect something of the visual simplification required in creating effective decoys, reducing complex reality to essential forms. But he never explicitly connected his artistic development to his military service, and we can only speculate. Others simply moved on, burying the memories under decades of peacetime normalcy. As years became decades, the operational details began fading from official concern. Cold War doctrine evolved away from the kind of static frontline warfare where Ghost Army tactics would be applicable. New technologies, satellite reconnaissance, thermal imaging, electronic intelligence, made old-style visual and sonic deception obsolete. In 1985, a handful of Ghost Army veterans began privately discussing whether they might be able to tell their story. They contacted the Army asking about declassification. The response was non-committal. Many documents remained classified, but perhaps some material could be released. It took another 11 years. In 1996, 51 years after VE Day, the Department of Defense officially declassified the Ghost Army's records. Finally, the full story could be told. A few veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, began giving interviews. Journalists discovered the story and were astonished. How had this never been known? How had such an extraordinary operation remained hidden for half a century? The answer was simple. Successful deception includes deceiving your own side about the fact that deception occurred. The Ghost Army had been so thoroughly compartmentalized, so completely buried in classification, that even military historians studying World War II hadn't known the full scope of their operations. Books were published, documentaries filmed, museum exhibits mounted. The men of the Ghost Army, those still alive, finally received recognition. War reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature, our capacity for violence, for cruelty, for destruction. But it also reveals something else, our capacity for creativity, for problem solving, for using ingenuity to preserve life rather than take it. The Ghost Army represents a peculiar kind of heroism. These were men who fought not with superior firepower, but with superior imagination. They saved lives not by killing more efficiently, but by deceiving more creatively. They understood that perception could be as powerful as reality, that what the enemy believed was true mattered as much as what was actually true. In an era when we remember World War II primarily through its battles and generals, its heroic charges and desperate stands, the Ghost Army reminds us that war is also a contest of intellect and creativity, that sometimes the bravest act is not to storm a position, but to make the enemy believe you're storming a position somewhere else, that soldiers armed with inflatable tanks and speaker systems could achieve what divisions with real firepower might not. These artist-turned-soldiers embodied a uniquely American approach to warfare. When faced with a problem, find a creative solution. When direct force is too costly, use misdirection. When the enemy expects conventional tactics, do something nobody's ever done before. And they remind us that the tools of peace, art, design, engineering, theatre, can become the instruments of war, not to destroy, but to preserve. When you think about World War II, think not just of the soldiers who crossed beaches and fought in hedgerows. Think also of the soldiers who carried canvas and rubber, who orchestrated elaborate performances for an audience that couldn't know they were watching a show, who perfected the art of being seen without being there. We remember them not just for what they did, but for what they represent, the power of human creativity to find better ways, even in humanity's darkest hours.